He lived in a $500 haunted cabin with only his dog. A midnight bark exposed a truth hidden 60 years. They said the cabin was haunted, but Jack Mercer never believed in ghosts until the night Duke growled at a place no living man had touched in 60 years. By the time Jack pulled up that hidden stone, he realized the truth wasn't buried alone. And someone out there had killed to keep it quiet. Now the only thing standing between him and the same fate was a dog who refused to walk away. If you want another variation with a different emotional angle, just tell me. The storm hit Silver Ridge like a punishment. Wind crushed the treetops, dragging curtains of snow across the mountains as if trying to erase anything that dared to stand still. Jack Mercer stepped out of his old Chevy, boots sinking into drifts up to his ankles. For a long moment he just stood there, staring at the crooked cabin he had bought for $500. $500 for 60 years of silence. Duke jumped out behind him, landing in the snow with the calm precision of a soldier. The German shepherd lifted his head, nostrils flaring, reading the mountain the way Jack once read combat zones. Jack trusted that more than he trusted himself these days. PTSD had a way of lying to him, showing threats where there were none. But Duke never lied. "This is it, partner," Jack muttered, hauling his duffel over one shoulder. Home. Home was generous. The cabin leaned slightly to the west, roof patched in 3 different decades, porch sagging like tired bones. Most people in Pine Hollow warned him away from it. Some whispered the place was haunted. Others said anyone who stayed the night heard things under the floorboards. But ghosts didn't scare Jack. Living people did. Inside, he shoved the door open, coughing as a cloud of dust lifted into the freezing air. The fireplace was nothing but a crumbling stone mouth. The stove didn't work. The floor groaned under his boots like it wanted to speak. Jack lit a fire, slow and clumsy. When the flames finally caught, soft gold pushed the shadows back just far enough to feel human again. Duke lay beside him, stretched long, ears relaxed, but never still. It was the first time in months Jack wasn't surrounded by strangers. No barracks, no motels, no restless highways, just him and Duke. 2 survivors trying to outweight their ghosts. Jack leaned back against the wall, feeling the ache behind his eyes. Syria drifted up in fragments, burning sand. Screams swallowed by concrete. Duke pulling him from the rubble after the blast that killed half his unit. The dog had been a rookie then, lean and fire-eyed. Jack sometimes wondered if they saved each other in the same breath. He was drifting off when Duke's ears snapped upward. A low sound crawled from the shepherd's throat. Not fear, not confusion, focus. Jack knew that sound. He had heard it seconds before mines detonated, before gunfire erupted, before death stepped into the room. "What is it, boy?" Jack whispered. Duke didn't look at the door or the windows. He stared at the stone hearth. Jack straightened. "You kidding me?" Duke pushed up to his feet, tail stiff, muscles tight under his fur. He approached the fireplace with slow, deliberate steps. Then he barked, one sharp, explosive warning that ricocheted through the cabin. Jack flinched. "Hey, easy." Duke didn't ease. He pawed at the base of the stone. Claws scratched the mortar with a harsh, metallic rasp. His body shook with urgency, not panic. This was how he looked on missions when he locked onto explosives. Jack felt the cold creep up his spine, colder than the storm outside. Duke was trained to detect danger buried deep. Danger disguised. Danger that wanted to stay hidden. "You're telling me something's under there, aren't you?" Another bark, harder, the kind that carried a message. Jack grabbed the flashlight. He pressed a hand to the stone. Cold. Too cold. A slab near the center looked different, darker, smoother, almost as if someone had replaced it long after the rest of the cabin was built. Duke whined, pressing his nose to one specific seam. Jack's pulse quickened. "All right, I hear you." He fetched a crowbar from the truck. Kneeling beside Duke, he jammed the metal tip into the seam and pushed. The slab didn't budge. He pushed again, sweat beading despite the cold. Something shifted with a dull crack, like a breath escaping after years of being held. Jack froze. Duke went silent. A thin black line opened beneath the stone, exhaling a draft colder than Wyoming air had any right to be. The smell rolled out slow, rust, old wood, and something metallic that caught in Jack's throat. He slid the slab aside. Beneath it lay a narrow cavity, barely big enough for a man to crawl through. Dust clung to its edges like ash. Then the flashlight beam caught on something pale. Cloth, then a sleeve, then the unmistakable curve of a dry, skeletal hand. Jack staggered back so hard he hit the wall. Duke growled, low and thunder-deep. Outside, the wind slammed against the cabin like a warning of its own. Snow rattled the glass. Jack stood there, breath sharp, staring at the hollow he had unearthed. He didn't realize his hands were shaking until Duke pressed his muzzle against them, grounding him. "Easy, boy. I'm all right." But he wasn't, because as Jack knelt again, the fire crackled behind him, and beneath the floor, from somewhere deeper than the cavity he'd opened, came a faint knock. One, then another, like someone trapped below had heard them. Jack's breath hitched. Duke's hackles rose, every hair sharp as pine needles. The storm screamed outside, but inside the cabin, something else had answered back. And for the first time since arriving at Silver Ridge, Jack felt the truth settle into the room like a living thing. They were not alone. Jack told himself it was nothing. Old cabins made noises. Wind got under the boards. Storms shook the rafters. Snow settled in strange ways. That was the logic he clung to as he stared at the open cavity beneath the fireplace. But logic didn't explain Duke. The dog hadn't moved an inch since the knock. His body was stone still, eyes locked on the base of the hearth. He wasn't watching the door. He wasn't checking the windows. Every cell in him pointed to the stones as if the danger lived inside them. Jack swallowed hard. "Hey, boy, it's just the storm." Duke didn't even flick an ear. Instead, he stepped forward, lowered his head, and began to dig at the floor with sharp, deliberate strokes. Nails scraped the mortar, sending a screech through the cabin. His growl rolled low, a steady vibration that Jack felt through the floorboards. That sound froze Jack more than the wind outside ever could. He had heard Duke growl like that once before. Syria, an abandoned compound, a buried pressure plate waiting under sand so fine it looked like dust. Duke had stopped Jack with that same low warning. Pause digging at a seam in the floor just moments before the device was triggered. The memory tightened Jack's chest. He crouched beside Duke, doing what he always did when fear and instinct collided. He listened to the dog. "Show me, boy," he whispered. Duke sniffed along the stone base, breath quick and sharp. Then he pressed one paw hard against a specific corner. Not random, not frantic, intentional. He looked up at Jack as if asking, "Why aren't you seeing this yet?" Jack angled the flashlight again. That same seam he noticed earlier appeared clearer now. A faint outline running under the hearth, more precise than the rest of the cabin's crude construction. The stone wasn't part of the foundation. It had been placed there, measured, set, hidden. Jack exhaled. Someone sealed something here. As if responding, Duke released a sudden, urgent bark that ricocheted through the cabin. Jack flinched, and for a heartbeat the storm outside vanished, replaced by pounding blood and the echo of old explosions. "Easy," Jack muttered, more to himself than the dog. "I need to think." But thinking had never kept him alive. Listening had. And Duke was no ordinary dog. 9 years of service had carved raw instinct into him. The shepherd picked up things humans weren't wired to notice: buried chemicals, traces of metal, vibrations in the earth. And now, something inside a 60-year-old cabin at the edge of Wyoming. The knocking came again. 3 short taps. Clear, hollow, like someone using bone on wood. Jack's breath caught. He swung the flashlight toward the opening beneath the lifted stone, but the hole swallowed the beam. He couldn't see the bottom. He couldn't see anything. The sound had come from deeper than that first cavity, somewhere below the cabin's original foundation. Duke growled again, louder this time. "Okay, that's not the wind," Jack whispered. He shuffled backward, rising to his feet as the cabin groaned around them. The storm battered the walls, snow thudding against the window. But underneath it all, beneath the noise of the mountain, came another faint knock. Slow, patient, almost rhythmic. Duke stiffened, his ears pointed toward the floor. Then he did something that made Jack's stomach knot. He backed away. Duke never retreated. Not from gunfire, not from explosives, not from any threat Jack had seen in a decade. But he backed away from the hearth, hackles raised, tail low, eyes locked on the stones as if something just below them had stepped closer. Jack's throat tightened. Something's moving down there. He grabbed his crowbar again and pressed it into another seam. The moment metal touched stone, Duke barked. Not in warning this time, in urgency, as if urging Jack to hurry or to stop. Jack couldn't tell which. He leaned closer. The mortar looked newer, not decades old like the rest of the cabin. It had been repaired recently. Maybe years, maybe months. His flashlight beam swept the wall. Something caught the light. A hairline crack running horizontally across the base of the fireplace. A crack that didn't match the wood, the age, or the storm. A crack shaped like a door. Jack froze. No, not a door. A hatch. Someone had built a second entrance under the hearth, a hidden chamber beneath an already hidden pit. The knocking sounded again, louder this time. The floorboards under Jack's feet trembled faintly. Duke barked once, sharp and commanding, then lunged toward Jack, grabbing the sleeve of his jacket with his teeth and pulling him back. Not playfully, not wildly, purposefully. Jack stumbled away from the hearth just as a deep thud sounded beneath the cabin. A thud so heavy the firewood beside the pit shifted. Jack's heart slammed into his ribs. Something down there was moving. Duke planted himself between Jack and the fireplace, legs braced, chest wide, the stance of a soldier ready for impact. Jack whispered, "What the hell is under this place?" Outside, the wind roared harder, shaking the cabin. Snow piled against the windows until the world beyond disappeared. But inside the cabin, the only thing Jack heard was the steady growl of a German shepherd who sensed danger no human could measure. The knocking stopped. Silence stretched long and thin across the room. Then, deep below the floor, something scraped. Slow. Dragging, like metal across stone. Duke did not blink. Neither did Jack. The mountain held its breath, and Jack understood, with a clarity that cut straight through fear. Duke hadn't been reacting to the storm at all. He had been warning Jack from the moment they stepped inside. The cabin wasn't haunted. It was occupied. The stone came loose with a crack that felt too loud for the small cabin, echoing off the walls like a gunshot. Jack dropped to one knee, breathing hard, crowbar still in hand. Duke hovered at his shoulder, muscles tight, breath quick, eyes locked on the pit as if expecting something to crawl out. Jack aimed the flashlight into the cavity. The light caught dust first. Thick, unmoving. Then fabric. Torn, brown with age, fused to the earth in clumps. He swallowed hard, pushing the beam farther. Something pale rose from the dirt. A hand. Dry, skeletal, the fingers curled inward like they had died, reaching for something that never came. Jack jerked backward so fast he lost his grip on the crowbar. It clattered across the floor. Duke lunged forward, then stopped, front paws planted at the edge of the pit, growling deep. The sound vibrated through the wooden floor into Jack's spine. Easy, boy, easy. He didn't believe his own words. His breath came shallow, metallic in his mouth. He forced himself to look again. Beside the skeletal arm lay a stack of notebooks tied with twine, so old it had frayed into dust. The covers were warped, edges browned, but the ink on the top one remained surprisingly legible. Harold Quinn. Jack's chest tightened. He knew that name. Any American who had grown up in the West knew it. A reporter who vanished 60 years ago while digging into corruption at the old Copper Valley mine. Local legend said he walked into the mountains one night and never walked out. Some said he ran. Others said he was silenced. Most chalked it up to the way mountains swallowed people. Jack reached down with shaking fingers and lifted the top notebook. The air that rose from the cavity was cold enough to sting. Duke whimpered, nudging Jack's elbow as if urging him to stop. But Jack couldn't. He opened the notebook. The first page held a date from 1963 and a neat line of handwriting. If someone finds this, it means they got to me. Jack's stomach flipped. He turned the page. More notes. Names he didn't recognize. Then a sentence underlined twice. The mine is poisoning the river. People are getting sick. They know. They don't care. Jack flipped ahead. The entries grew messier, frantic. Descriptions of trucks arriving at night. Chemicals dumped into old shafts. Quinn wrote like a man who knew he was running out of time. Then the writing stopped. Mid-sentence. A jagged ink line dragged across the page as if the pen had been yanked from him. Duke barked, sharp and sudden, snapping Jack out of the moment. His tail was stiff, his gaze fixed not on the notebooks, but on the far corner of the hearth. The same place he had warned about before the stone broke loose. Jack froze. The cabin was silent except for the fire popping behind him. Then, just faintly, came a scraping sound from deeper below. Not the knocks from before. Something slower, heavier, moving. Jack backed up until his shoulder hit the wall. Duke pressed close, body shielding Jack in a way that pulled a memory from the deepest part of him. Syria. A collapsed apartment block. Dust filling the air so thick it turned the world white. Jack crawling toward a trapped soldier screaming under the rubble. Then a second explosion. A sudden roar, concrete cracking overhead. Jack pinned. Breath crushed out of him. And Duke leaping over debris, claws scraping stone, grabbing Jack's vest collar and dragging him out seconds before the ceiling gave way. Afterward, they found 3 bodies under the collapse. Men Jack had tried to save. Men he still dreamed of. Jack blinked hard. The cabin swam back into focus. Duke's warmth steadied him. "Buddy," Jack whispered, "talk to me. What are you seeing?" Duke stepped forward, nose twitching at the edge of the pit. He didn't bark now. He didn't growl. Instead, he released a quiet whine Jack had only heard 3 times in 9 years. Once during a missile strike. Once when Jack had nearly bled out. Once when they lost a boy they had tried to rescue. It meant danger close. Danger they couldn't see. Jack forced a breath. "We're not alone down there." The scraping below stopped as abruptly as it began. Silence pressed against the cabin walls, thick and unnatural. Even the wind outside seemed to pull back. Jack shone the flashlight deeper into the pit, searching for the source. Dirt shifted. Something metal glinted before disappearing into shadow. He reached for the crowbar again, but Duke blocked him with his body, planting himself firmly between Jack and the opening. The dog's eyes burned with a message Jack understood without words. Not yet. Jack swallowed. All right, we pull back. He stood, scooping up the notebooks. The pages trembled in his hands. Duke stayed locked on the hearth, refusing to turn his back on it. Jack scanned the room, the fireplace, the floor, the windows. Every part of him felt exposed, as if the cabin had suddenly become a stage, and something beneath it watched from the dark. He whispered, "Someone put him down there. Someone sealed him in." The words tasted bitter. Harold Quinn didn't get lost. He was buried. Duke stepped closer to Jack, nudging the notebooks with his nose, then glancing back towards the pit. Jack understood that too. This wasn't just a buried story. It was a message, a warning, a truth someone tried to silence 6 decades ago. And Duke, loyal and relentless, had dug up the first piece. Jack looked down at the dog who had saved him more times than he could count. "You found him for a reason, didn't you?" Duke held his stare without blinking. Outside, the storm screamed against the cabin once more. But the sound didn't matter anymore, because now Jack knew the truth. What was under the cabin wasn't haunting the place. It was calling for help. The storm broke at dawn, leaving Silver Ridge glazed in white and silence thick enough to choke on. Jack barely slept. Every time he drifted off, the scraping beneath the cabin pulled him back. Duke stayed awake through most of the night, pacing in slow, tense lines and stopping only to stare at the hearth. By morning, Jack needed answers, or at least voices that weren't buried under decades of dirt. He packed the notebook with Harold Quinn's name into his jacket, clipped Duke's leash, and headed into Pine Hollow. The town sat 11 miles down the mountain, a small cluster of old storefronts and snow-choked alleys. Jack pulled into the diner because it was the only place with lights on, and because the smell of coffee drifting from the vents felt human in a way he suddenly craved. Inside, the heat fogged his glasses. Conversations died mid-sentence. Forks paused halfway to mouths. A veteran with a dog wasn't unusual in Wyoming, but a newcomer driving in from a supposedly haunted cabin tended to kill morning chatter fast. Duke walked beside him, tail low but step steady, scanning the room with practiced calm. Jack felt eyes tracing him, cautious and curious in equal measure. But Duke didn't bristle. If he wasn't concerned, Jack wouldn't be either. He sat at the counter. A young woman with auburn hair and tired eyes approached, pen tucked behind her ear as if she had forgotten it was there. Name tag read, Lena. "Coffee," she said. It wasn't a question. "Please," Jack said. She poured the mug full, her gaze flicking to Duke. "Service dog?" she guessed. "Retired," Jack said softly. "He's smarter than most people I know." She almost smiled. "Most dogs are." Lena leaned closer. "You're the one up in the old Collins place." Jack stiffened. "I didn't know it had a name." Everything here has a name, even the things that should have stayed forgotten. That answer chilled him more than the wind outside. He reached into his jacket and slid the notebook across the counter. Lena glanced down, and for a heartbeat her whole face changed. The pen behind her ear slipped and hit the floor. "Where did you find that?" she whispered. "Under my cabin," Jack said. Lena looked around. The diner had gone quiet again. She lowered her voice. "Harold Quinn disappeared 60 years ago. People said he ran, said he had money trouble, said he saw something he shouldn't have. No one ever found his body." Jack held her gaze. "I found part of it." Lena swallowed. Her hands trembled as she tapped the notebook with one finger. "You don't understand what this means. This town doesn't let the past come up easy. People here—" She hesitated, then leaned closer. "People here don't like the truth touched, especially not Quinn's." Duke lifted his head, ears tilting towards the door. Jack noticed the shift immediately. Duke had a way of reading danger seconds before it became visible. Lena followed Duke's gaze. A man in a dark coat stood just outside the diner's window. He wasn't looking in, but he wasn't looking away either. His posture was too still, his face turned just enough to catch the reflection of the room. Lena's voice dropped. "You need to be careful. Someone already knows you're digging." Jack kept his face neutral. "I haven't told anyone. You did the moment you drove off that mountain. Everyone knows who buys the Collins cabin, and everyone remembers who vanished there." He was about to ask more when Duke stood abruptly, body straight, head locked on the door. Jack knew that posture, not aggression, alert. Something outside had shifted in a way only Duke sensed. The door opened. A bitter gust swept in, but no one entered. Just a flash of a figure stepping away, boots crunching on fresh snow. Jack paid quickly. Lena caught his hand as he reached for the notebook. "If you're smart, you'll burn that," she whispered, "and leave before nightfall." Jack pulled his hand back. "I'm done running." Lena exhaled through her nose, as if she already knew that answer. Then she said something that stuck in his spine. "The mountain takes the people who don't listen." Jack and Duke walked outside. The man in the dark coat was gone. Snow fell in slow, deliberate flakes, erasing footprints too fast for human eyes. But Duke found something. He tracked a scent across the porch, nose low, tail rigid. "What is it, boy?" Duke followed the trail to Jack's truck and stopped. Beneath the bumper, the snow was disturbed. A clear boot print marked the ground, deeper than any Jack had made. Someone had stood there for a long time, watching the diner door, waiting for him to come out. Jack scanned the parking lot, but the streets were empty. The mountains loomed behind the town, quiet and wide. Too wide. Back at the cabin, the feeling worsened. Duke stepped out first, sniffing the air. His ears shot up. He moved to the left side of the house, pressing his nose into the snow. Jack followed and froze. Boot prints. Not his, not the ones he made earlier. These circled the cabin completely. A slow, patient ring of footsteps, as if someone had taken their time, studying every inch. Jack crouched, brushing snow from one print. The edges were sharp. Fresh. They had been made while he was gone. Someone had been close enough to touch the walls. Duke's growl rumbled through the clearing. He backed toward Jack, positioning himself between his handler and the cabin. Jack whispered, "Someone was here, boy." Duke didn't look at him. His eyes stayed fixed on the tree line. Not fearful. Ready. Jack stood slowly, scanning the forest. Pines swayed in the wind. Shadows shifted, but nothing moved that Jack could see. Still he felt it. A presence in the silence. Watching. Waiting. Lena's warning replayed in his head. People here don't like the truth being dug up. Jack tightened his grip on the notebook. Duke stepped closer, brushing his shoulder against Jack's leg in a gesture that meant both reassurance and urgency. "All right," Jack whispered. "We're not backing off." Behind them, under the cabin's floor, something knocked again. Once. Then silence. Duke leaned forward, ears locked. And Jack understood that whatever he had uncovered hadn't just been forgotten. It had been protected. Jack was chopping wood behind the cabin when Duke froze mid-step. His ears snapped forward, body leaning toward the driveway. Jack followed his gaze. A black SUV crawled up the snowy path, engine humming like something too polished for the mountain. It stopped a few yards from the porch. The door opened, and a man stepped out dressed in a tailored winter coat that had never seen real cold. Cole Maddox. Jack recognized the name instantly. Maddox Mining, the corporation that once owned half of Silver Ridge. The same company Harold Quinn had been investigating before he disappeared. Maddox smiled the way men smile when they never hear the word no. "Heard you bought the Collins cabin." Jack wiped his palms on his jacket. "Word travels fast. It does when a man chooses the one place nobody should choose." Maddox said, His eyes drifted across the cabin, the mountains, the untouched snow. Then they landed on Duke. "Fine animal you have." Duke responded with a low growl. Maddox stepped onto the first porch stair. Duke exploded. He lunged with such force the leash ripped through Jack's fingers. The shepherd planted himself at the bottom of the porch, teeth bared, body rigid, a warning from a creature who had smelled danger long before humans put a name to it. Maddox froze, raising both hands in a polished gesture of surrender. "Easy there. I mean no harm." Jack grabbed Duke's collar, pulling him back. He had never seen Duke react like that to a stranger who hadn't made a direct threat. Duke's instincts weren't casual. They were precise. Maddox waited until Duke settled slightly before speaking again. "I'll get to the point. I'd like to buy your property." Jack frowned. "It's not for sale. I'm willing to pay 20 times what you paid." Maddox said, smooth and slow, $100,000 for a cabin you bought for $5. Jack stared. That kind of money didn't appear without a reason. "Why? Call it nostalgia. My company used to own this land. It's only right it comes back home." Duke growled again, louder. Jack stepped between them. The answer's no. Maddox's eyes hardened just enough for Jack to catch it. He looked past Jack, at the windows, at the hearth he could not possibly see from the outside. Then back to Jack with a smile too gentle for the cold in his eyes. "Things buried in these mountains should stay buried, Mr. Mercer." The words slid into the air like a warning disguised as neighborly advice. Jack didn't blink. "I'll keep that in mind." Maddox nodded once, turned, and walked back to his SUV. Duke stalked him the entire way, muscles coiled, eyes blazing with the same instinct he used to track explosives. Maddox paused before opening his door. The mountain doesn't forget. Neither do the people tied to it. Then he drove off, tires spitting snow. The trees swallowed the sound quickly, but the unease he left behind stayed pressed against the cabin walls. Jack knelt beside Duke. "What did you smell on him?" Duke didn't look at Jack. His gaze stayed locked on the road where the SUV vanished, body trembling with restrained warning. Jack placed a hand on his neck. Duke's fur bristled under his touch. That night the wind died. The silence felt staged, like the mountain was waiting for something. Jack sat at the table, with the notebook again. Quinn's words blurred, the ink smeared by age, but the message remained. Corruption, poison, secrets buried because they couldn't be burned. Duke paced the cabin, uneasy. Every few steps he glanced toward the fireplace. His body stayed low, tail stiff, as if the ground itself whispered something he didn't like. Jack had just stood to add a log to the fire when the sound returned. A knock, hard, direct. Not the soft taps from before. This was deliberate, like someone using their full strength. Jack froze. Duke whipped around and launched toward the hearth, barking violently. His paws hit the stones with force, claws scraping a furious warning. Jack grabbed the flashlight. The sound came again, louder, a heavy rhythm. 3 knocks, a pause, then 2 more, a pattern. Duke snarled, teeth flashing as he clawed the base of the hearth, trying to dig through stone. Jack kneeled beside him, flashlight trembling in his hand. The floorboards vibrated, just slightly, but enough for Jack to feel it in his bones. Something under the foundation moved. Jack shined the flashlight into the crack, left by the stone he had lifted earlier. The darkness swallowed the light at first. Then something shifted. A faint scrape, a whisper of movement, as if someone, or something, was dragging weight across the lower chamber. Duke pressed back against Jack, guarding him with his body. Jack whispered, "It's not wind. It's not the cabin settling." Duke barked once in agreement, sharp enough to sting Jack's ears. The knocking hit again. This time the cabin shook. Jack stumbled back, heart hammering. Duke stood firm, fur raised, chest broad, the stance of a soldier blocking danger. A final blow struck the underside of the hearth, rattling the stones. Then silence. Not emptiness, not calm, waiting. Jack sat against the wall, breath ragged, Duke tucked close, eyes still locked on the hearth. Maddox's voice echoed in Jack's head. "The mountain doesn't forget." Jack looked at Duke. The dog didn't blink. Someone wanted him out of that cabin, but something buried below wanted him to stay. The mountain went still before anything happened. Jack noticed it first in Duke. The dog froze mid-step, ears slicing upward, every muscle locking like a wire pulled tight. The air inside the cabin changed, heavy, metallic, almost electric. Then Duke growled. Not the low warning he gave strangers. This one was primal, raw, the kind of sound that said, "Run or fight, because there is no third option." Jack grabbed his flashlight and followed Duke toward the hearth. The dog wasn't looking at the stones this time. He was staring at the narrow crack beneath the floorboards beside them, a place Jack had barely noticed before. Duke sniffed once, then began digging so violently dust exploded into the air. The wood groaned under his paws. Jack knelt beside him, pulling away broken boards. A hollow space opened beneath. Jack leaned close. Duke shoved his head inside and barked once, as if announcing the discovery. A tunnel. Old, narrow, supported by beams that looked like they'd been placed decades earlier. Someone had once used this as a way in, or a way out. Jack grabbed his jacket and flashlight. Duke was already inside, tail low, body moving with the certainty of a dog who had spent years crawling through collapsed buildings and war ruins. Halfway down the tunnel, the cabin above them shook. Then came the first explosion. The sound boomed overhead, sending dust raining into Jack's hair. Heat followed. The sharp scent of gasoline burst through the cracks. "They're burning it," Jack whispered. Duke barked, pushing forward faster. Jack crawled after him, heart hammering. Flames roared above, crawling across the floorboards they'd been standing on minutes before. Someone had thrown firebombs through the windows. Someone was trying to erase everything. They reached the end of the tunnel, just as a section of the cabin collapsed behind them. Jack kicked out the final board. A rush of cold air hit his face. They emerged behind a cluster of boulders in a narrow ravine. Shadows moved above them on the ridge. Two figures in white winter camouflage carrying rifles with suppressors. Duke growled so deeply the ground seemed to vibrate. Jack pulled him close. "Stay low." He scanned the trees. The men moved with practiced formation, checking angles, scanning tracks. They weren't kids. They were professionals. Maddox hadn't sent threats this time. He had sent cleanup. One of the men pulled a radio from his vest. Cabins lit. Nothing left but ash. The second man asked, "What about the dog and the guy? Orders are to confirm the burn and search the perimeter. No loose ends." Jack clenched his jaw. Duke pressed against his leg, eyes locked on the two figures. Then one of the men stepped too close to the edge of the ravine. Snow crunched, a straight shot for a trained K9. Duke didn't wait for Jack's command. He launched. A blur of black and tan muscle shot from the shadows. The first man barely turned before Duke hit him full force, knocking him to the ground, teeth finding the wrist that held the weapon. The rifle clattered across the ice as Duke dragged the man down. The second man swung his gun toward Duke, but Jack burst from the ravine, slamming into him with his full weight. They crashed into the snow. The man fought like a hired soldier, strong, sharp, no hesitation. But Jack had spent a lifetime fighting men like him. He jammed the attacker's elbow sideways, forcing the gun loose, then pinned him with his knee. Duke growled, teeth locked into the first man's jacket, preventing him from reaching the spare weapon at his hip. The man screamed, more in fear than pain. Jack grabbed the second man's radio and ripped it free. "Who sent you?" The man spat snow. "You already know." Maddox. The man said nothing, but his silence was confirmation. Jack tightened his grip. Tell me why. Tell me what's under that cabin. The man hesitated. Duke snarled behind Jack, shaking the first man until he froze. The attacker exhaled. Quinn. He found something he shouldn't have. Something Maddox Mining buried for decades. Jack pressed harder. What did he find? Poison. The man winced beneath Jack's weight. The mine dumped heavy metals into the valley stream back in the 60s. People got sick. Kids died. Quinn found the documents, the locations. He hid copies in that cabin. Maddox couldn't let them surface. Jack felt his chest contract. He knew towns that had been killed by poisoned water, entire communities erased. Why murder Quinn instead of buying him off? The man looked away. He wasn't the only one who knew. They wanted to make an example, and they sealed his body there so no one would believe a reporter just vanished. The mountain would take the blame. Jack's stomach twisted. The man added quietly, "And Maddox sent us because he thinks you found what Quinn left behind." Snow fell heavier now, covering the tracks of their struggle. Jack pulled the man's hands behind his back with a zip tie from his pocket. The other man lay subdued under Duke's weight, gasping for breath, too afraid to move. Jack stood slowly, heart pounding, breath fogging in the cold. Duke trotted to him, eyes bright with adrenaline and loyalty. Jack knelt, pressing his forehead to Duke's for one steady second. "Good boy, you saved us again." Behind them, the cabin collapsed fully, flames swallowed by falling snow. The truth Maddox wanted erased had burned on the surface, but not beneath. Not until Jack walked away. He grabbed the notebooks from inside his jacket, the only surviving evidence, and looked toward Pine Hollow. Maddox thought he had buried the past, but Duke had dug it back up. And now Jack Mercer would not let it die again. Snow hammered the ridge as Jack and Duke fought their way down the narrow trail, the stolen radio crackling in Jack's pocket. The men they had subdued were zip-tied and hidden in the ravine, but Jack knew Maddox would send more. Men like him didn't stop at one failed hit. They escalated. Jack reached a rocky shelf overlooking Pine Hollow. For the first time since arriving in Wyoming, he heard something familiar. Helicopter rotors. Not close, but not far. He grabbed the notebook bundle from his coat and pulled out his phone. No signal here. He needed someone he could trust. Someone quick. Lena Brooks. He hesitated only a second before hitting dial. The call went through immediately. "Jack!" Her voice rushed. "Please tell me you're hiding somewhere safe." He looked at Duke, paws bleeding from rock and ice, body shaking but still alert. "Define safe," Jack said. Lena let out a breath that sounded like she'd been holding it for hours. "Send me everything you found. All of it." Jack fired the files across the weak connection. Photos of Quinn's notebooks, the vial labels, the coordinates, the confession he'd recorded from one of the attackers. Lena's voice dropped. "I need to tell you something. I'm not just a waitress. I'm a freelancer for the Denver Sentinel. I've been digging into Maddox Mining for years." Jack felt the ground shift under him. "You followed me to the cabin on purpose. I followed the story, and you just proved it's real." She paused. "I have contacts with the FBI's Environmental Crimes Division. They'll move fast, but you need to hold out until they arrive." Jack looked around at the endless white forest. "That may be a problem." "Why?" Duke stiffened before Jack answered. His ears shot up. A sharp bark ripped from his chest, aimed downhill. "Because Maddox already knows where I am." The first gunshot cracked through the trees. Snow burst next to Jack's boot. "Move!" Jack yelled. He and Duke sprinted across the ridge, sliding behind a fallen log as bullets chewed into the bark. Duke stayed pressed to Jack's side, not flinching, eyes scanning the terrain like a soldier. Heavy boots approached through the snow. Voices. Jack recognized one immediately. Cole Maddox. Fan out. Bring me Mercer. And shoot that damn dog." Jack felt Duke stiffen beside him. He cupped the dog's muzzle with his hand, whispering the command he'd used only once in Syria. "Steady." Duke didn't make a sound. Maddox's men swept the tree line, weapons raised. Jack eased his rifle up, but Maddox stepped into view before he could fire. Smug, confident, wearing a coat too clean for the mountains. "This is your last chance, Mercer. Hand over the evidence. Walk away alive. I don't need the dog." Duke growled. Maddox chuckled. "Loyal, isn't he? Shame loyalty doesn't pay bills." Jack rose enough for Maddox to see him. "You poisoned people for 60 years. You buried a journalist under my floor. You don't get to walk away from that." Maddox lifted his pistol. "Then you die with it." He fired. The shot echoed across the ridge. Jack flinched, but Duke moved first. The dog lunged sideways, slamming into Jack as the bullet tore past. Before Jack could grab him, a second shot rang out. Duke yelped, a sharp, small sound that cut deeper than any wound Jack ever took in service. Duke stumbled, snow blooming red along his ribs. Jack dropped to him instantly. Duke's eyes were still alert, still locked on Maddox. "Stay with me," Jack whispered, voice cracking. Maddox stepped forward to finish it, raising his pistol. Then the sky opened. A helicopter roared above the ridge, its spotlight slicing through the snow like a blade. A loudspeaker boomed. "Federal agents, drop your weapons." Maddox spun, panicked, firing blindly at the chopper. His men scattered, slipping in the snow. Ropes dropped from the aircraft as agents descended with precision and speed. Jack held Duke close as chaos erupted around them. Maddox tried to run. He didn't make it 10 steps. A figure stepped out from behind a pine, shotgun leveled. Sheriff Tom Ridley. His face was pale, jaw clenched tight. "Going somewhere, Cole?" Maddox froze. "You work for me, Sheriff." "Not anymore." Ridley cocked the shotgun. "My father died drinking water from your mines. I didn't know it then. I know it now." Maddox dropped his gun. Agents swarmed him, slamming him into the snow, cuffing him as he screamed threats no one listened to. His men surrendered, one by one. Ridley approached Jack, breath misting in the cold. "You all right, son?" Jack nodded toward Duke. "He needs help." Ridley knelt beside the dog, touching Duke's shoulder gently. "He'll get it. The FBI has medics already inbound. And Mercer, thank you." Jack wasn't expecting gratitude. He didn't know what to do with it. Federal agents fanned out across the ridge. Cameras recorded the scene. Evidence bags snapped open. Maddox shouted useless curses as agents dragged him to the landing zone. And through it all, Duke refused to lie down. Even bleeding, even trembling, he kept himself between Jack and danger. Jack wrapped an arm around him, lowering his voice. "You did good, buddy, real good. Just rest now. I've got you." Duke finally allowed himself to lean into Jack's chest. Snow settled softly over the ridge as the helicopter's rotors slowed. The mountain exhaled. For the first time since the cabin burned, Jack felt the shift. The fear was lifting. Maddox was finished. And Duke, even wounded, stood like a soldier who knew the mission wasn't over yet. He would not fall until Jack was safe. Not ever. When the snow finally began to thaw, the mountains changed first. The wind softened. The trees shook off their icy weight. Streams carved new paths through the valley. Pine Hollow, a town once built on silence and suspicion, exhaled for the first time in decades. Jack Mercer felt that shift in his bones. The morning after Maddox's arrest, he stood on the ridge overlooking what remained of his cabin. The fire had eaten everything. Only the stone foundation remained, blackened and cracked. Smoke still curled from the charred beams buried beneath the snowmelt. But the heart of the cabin had survived. The old hearthstone lay there, scorched but solid. The same slab Duke had clawed at on that first night. the same place Harold Quinn had tried to leave the truth. Jack touched the stone and let his hand rest there. It was cold, but not dead. Not anymore. Behind him, Duke barked softly. He turned. The dog limped toward him with a slow but steady gait, bandage wrapped around his ribs. His fur had been shaved around the wound, leaving a patch of pink skin, but his eyes burned the same copper-bright fire as always. The vet had warned him Duke needed weeks to recover, but Duke had never been one for schedules. "You're supposed to be resting," Jack said. Duke sat beside him, leaning gently into Jack's leg. His tail tapped the ground once, the closest he ever came to a grin. Jack knelt and scratched behind his ears. "You saved my life, buddy." Again. Duke closed his eyes at the touch. No fear, no tension, just trust. A truck rumbled up the trail. Sheriff Ridley stepped out, taking in the ruins with a heavy sigh. "Pine Hollow owes you both more than you'll ever get credit for," he said. Jack straightened. "I didn't do it for the town." Ridley nodded. "I know. You did it because it was right. That's more than Maddox ever understood." Jack didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. Ridley walked toward the remains of the cabin, hands in his pockets. "The state's sending a cleanup team. Environmental guys, too. The water tests came back. Everything Quinn wrote was true." Jack looked at the stone foundation again. "People died because of that water. My father was one of them," Ridley said quietly. "My mother never forgave this mountain, but I think he would have liked seeing you tear Maddox's lies apart." Jack swallowed the weight in his chest. "I'm sorry." Ridley gave a weary smile. "Don't be. You did more for this place in 2 weeks than I did in 20 years wearing the badge." He tipped his hat and walked back to his truck. "Need anything, you know where to find me." Jack watched him go. Pine Hollow didn't feel the same town that had eyed him with suspicion days earlier. The air was warmer, the silence lighter. Jack spent the next few days hauling wood, clearing debris, and laying the first beams of a new cabin. It wasn't much yet. 4 posts, a patch of roof, a door that didn't quite fit the frame. But it stood. Every morning, Duke lay on a blanket nearby, watching him work. He didn't sleep much. Healing didn't come easy for a dog who feared missing something important. But whenever Jack picked up a beam or hammered a nail, Duke's tail brushed the ground. Approval. Encouragement. Presence. They were rebuilding together. One evening, as Jack was tightening the new roof supports, he heard a car pull up the trail. Lena climbed out, hair pulled back, notebook under her arm. "Thought you left town," Jack said. She smiled, not before finishing the story. He wiped sweat from his brow. "You're going to make Pine Hollow sound like a war zone." "It was a war zone," she said. "But now they know who started it and who ended it." She glanced at Duke, who wagged his tail once. "The dog likes you," Jack said. "That's rare." Lena knelt and scratched Duke gently, careful to avoid the healing wound. He earned the right to choose who he trusts. Jack leaned against the new frame of the cabin. So did Quinn. He hid the truth here, hoping someone would find it. Lena's voice softened, and someone did. They stood in silence for a moment. The wind carried the smell of thawing pine. The stream below hummed with early spring runoff. Lena stepped back. "I'll send you the article before it prints. The FBI wants to talk again next week. And the town council wants to help rebuild. Volunteers, supplies, whatever you need." Jack blinked. "That many people want to help?" "You saved their home, Jack. The least they can do is help you rebuild yours." She left shortly after, leaving Jack alone with the dog and the soft noise of the mountain waking up. Jack walked to the hearthstone and brushed off a layer of ash. He placed it at the center of the new cabin floor, anchoring it like a cornerstone. "This stays," he said. Duke moved closer, nose touching the edge of the stone. The dog seemed to understand. This was where the truth had lived, buried but unbroken. That night, Jack sat beside Duke, watching the last light fade behind Silver Ridge. The mountain no longer felt like a haunted reminder of what he'd lost. It felt like a place where things began again. Duke let out a contented sigh, lowering his head onto Jack's boot. "You and me," Jack whispered. "We'll make this place ours." The forest answered with a quiet hum, gentle and alive. For the first time in a long time, Jack felt the weight on his chest ease. Not gone, not yet, but lighter. Enough to breathe, enough to build, enough to stay. The storm had passed, and the truth had survived it. 1 year later, Silver Ridge felt like a different mountain. Not softer, not safer, just honest. The kind of honesty that comes after a long winter finally gives way to thaw. Jack Mercer stepped out onto the porch of the new cabin he'd built with his own hands. Morning mist clung to the treetops, drifting like slow ghosts that no longer had anything to hide. Duke lay beside him, thicker around the shoulders now, fur grown back full and glossy, the faint scar on his ribs barely visible beneath the coat. A better reminder than any photograph. Jack thought. A mark of survival. "You ready for another patrol?" he asked. Duke stood immediately, tail lifting, eyes sharp. He didn't bark. He didn't need to. The dog had never lost the habit of treating the valley like it was a quiet battlefield, a place that needed watching, guarding. Together, they set off down the narrow trail. Quinn Watch. That was the name Lena had insisted on. At first, Jack hated it. Sounded like some neighborhood committee with old men in vests and radios. But eventually he understood why she'd chosen it. Harold Quinn had given everything to warn the world. The least they could do was watch in his place. What started as just Jack and Duke walking the stream every few days became something bigger. Locals joined in. Molly Crane from the general store, old Mr. Henderson, the retired ranger who knew every bird in the valley by sound. Even Sheriff Ridley came on weekends, notebook in hand, wanting to make up for years of looking the other way. Together they tested water, documented wildlife, and kept an eye out for anyone trying to sneak back into the abandoned mines Maddox once guarded so fiercely. But the heart of Quinn Watch lived in the cabin. Jack had built a glass case in the center of the main room, right above the original stone slab Duke uncovered the first night. Inside that case, lit softly by a small overhead lamp, rested Harold Quinn's journals. Dozens of them. Some half-burned, some with pages brittle as leaves, but all intact, enough to read. Jack stood before the case most nights, fingers resting lightly on the cold glass. "You weren't forgotten, Harold," he'd whisper. "Not this time." Duke often sat beside him, eyes on the case as if recognizing the weight inside, as if he too understood Quinn was the ghost they'd freed. Lena arrived late in the afternoon. Jack heard her truck long before it reached the clearing. Duke did too, his ears perked, tail thumping with just enough force to hit the floor. Jack laughed. "You like her more than me, don't you?" Duke didn't deny it. Lena stepped out, phone in one hand, stack of papers in the other. She walked up the porch with the confidence of someone who'd made this place part of her life. "Morning," she said. "Big news. Every time you come up here, there's big news." Jack replied. "This time it's good news." She held out a folder. "The Bureau followed your recommendations. They're reopening the investigation into the deaths from the 60s, holding Maddox's board accountable, and someone new is asking questions about the mines." Jack raised an eyebrow. "Who?" "A senator from Montana. Her father worked these mountains once, heard about Quinn Watch and wants to collaborate." Jack whistled softly. That's something. Lena stepped inside the cabin, pausing in front of the glass case. This never stops feeling heavy, she said. It's supposed to be heavy, Jack replied. Truth usually is. She nodded, her expression softening. You know, you could come back to town more often. People ask about you. They want to thank you. Jack shrugged. I'm better up here. Lena smiled. I know. That's why I come to you. Duke pushed his head under her hand, demanding attention. She scratched behind his ear. Hey, hero. You're doing your rounds today. Duke barked once, sharp and proud. Jack shook his head. He thinks he runs the whole mountain. He does, Lena laughed. And honestly, he might do a better job than half the Forest Service. They headed outside as the sun dipped lower. The valley glowed in muted gold. Pine needles shimmered. The stream reflected the sky in broken strips. Jack knelt beside Duke. Ready to check the ridge? Duke moved forward instantly, nose to the ground, tail straight. Lena followed behind them, scribbling notes as Duke zigzagged through the brush. He found things no human ever could. Disturbed soil, strange scents, tracks that led nowhere. Once he uncovered old mining samples buried under fresh dirt. Another time, he found a discarded glove with residue that matched chemicals from the old dumping sites. Every discovery went into Lena's reports, which then made their way to investigators and environmental groups. Pine Hollow was becoming a case study on how truth gets buried and how it gets dug up again. Near sunset, Duke stopped abruptly at the edge of the ridge. He stood tall, ears forward, gaze locked on something beyond the clearing. What is it? Jack asked quietly. Duke didn't move for a long moment, then he stepped forward 2 paces and sat, watching the valley below as if guarding it. Jack followed his gaze. The mountains stretched endlessly, their peaks catching the last of the sunlight. A place easy to lose things, a place even easier to hide them, but not anymore. Lena stood beside them, eyes glowing in the fading light. I'm writing something new, she said, a piece on how this valley changed, on how the truth won. Jack looked at Duke. You sure the truth won? He asked softly. Lena smiled. It won enough to matter. Duke leaned against Jack's leg, warm and solid. A silent vow. Jack placed a hand on the dog's back. Whatever comes next, we'll be here. The valley fell into twilight. The mountain breathed, and man and dog stood at its edge, not as survivors anymore, but as keepers of a legacy that refused to be buried again. The late afternoon sun settled over Silver Ridge, turning the pine needles into threads of gold. The rebuilt cabin stood quiet against the slope, smoke curling lightly from the chimney. Jack Mercer sat on the porch steps, boots planted in warm dust, coffee cooling beside him. Duke lay stretched across the boards, head raised just enough to watch the valley. His coat had grown lighter over the year, streaked with silver that caught the sunlight like frost. But his eyes were unchanged, sharp, steady, wise in ways no animal should be. The air hummed with the soft rustle of the trees and the river far below. Peace didn't make a sound, not really, but after everything they had survived, Jack could feel it settling into the mountain like a long-delayed breath. A car door shut behind them. Jack didn't turn. Duke did, ears flicking, but he didn't rise. He'd learned the difference between threat and presence. This was the latter. A reporter stepped onto the porch, recorder in hand, notebook tucked under her arm. She was young, earnest, the kind of curious that hadn't been beaten out by the world yet. Thanks for agreeing to the interview, she said. I know you're not big on cameras. Jack gave a small shrug. Not big on talking about myself either. She smiled. Well, everyone else is telling your story. I figured we might as well hear your version. Jack nodded once. Let's get it done before Duke decides it's dinner time. Her gaze drifted to the dog, softened, then returned to Jack. The first question was gentle, almost hesitant. Do you think Duke knew what he was digging up that first night? Jack exhaled slowly. He looked at Duke, at the dog who had saved him in Syria, who had dragged him through fire, who had found a 60-year-old truth buried under abandoned stone. Duke lifted his head, meeting Jack's eyes with that same unbreakable connection. Jack turned back to the reporter. He always knows. That first night, he wasn't barking at the wind or the storm. He wasn't hungry. He wasn't scared. He was calling something out. Calling what out? Jack's voice lowered. Something wrong. Something buried. Something that didn't want to stay hidden. The reporter waited, pen hovering. Jack looked again at Duke. The dog blinked once, slow and sure, like a quiet affirmation. He didn't bark for food, Jack said softly. He barked for the truth. The words hung in the air. Heavy, final, true. A breeze picked up, running through the pines with a whisper that felt like an answer from the mountain itself. The kind of sound that carried memory, old and stubborn and alive. The reporter swallowed. That's powerful. Jack shrugged again, but his eyes stayed on Duke. He's the one who did the hard part. I just followed where he pointed. She flipped her notebook closed. Last question, she said, lifting the camera. Look into the lens. Jack hesitated. Cameras felt too close, too bright, like they could see things even he hadn't figured out how to name. But Duke nudged his hand with his nose, a quiet push of reassurance. Jack looked into the lens. If you've ever had a dog who stood between you and danger, who saw storms before you felt the rain, who kept you together when the world came apart, then you already know. He paused, letting the silence settle. What's your story with a loyal pet? The reporter's eyes shined, though she pretended to adjust her camera instead of wiping them. Duke rose on stiff legs and walked to Jack's side, sitting so close their shoulders touched. The valley below glowed as the sun dropped lower, spreading long shadows across the cabin that had risen from ashes. Jack reached down and rested his hand on Duke's back. We made it, buddy, he whispered. Duke leaned into him, steady and warm. The reporter packed up her gear and walked to her car, leaving Jack and Duke together in the quiet. She stopped before closing the door. I think people are going to feel this story, Jack. They need it. Jack nodded. Then let's hope they listen. When she drove off, the mountain returned to its soft, breathing silence. Jack stayed on the porch as the last light faded, hand still resting on Duke's back. This place wasn't haunted anymore, not by fear, not by lies, only by truth, and the dog who refused to let it stay, buried. Jack stood and stepped inside, Duke following close behind. Before shutting the door, he spoke into the evening air. If you've ever known a dog like him, share your story. The wind carried the words away, letting them settle somewhere beyond the ridge, somewhere others would hear them. Then the screen fades to black, and Jack's voice returns one last time. If you believe in loyalty, courage, and the bond between a person and their dog, subscribe to German Shepherd Stories, because here every bark still carries the truth.